Examination into the Enfield local plan. Everybody, this is a continuation of yesterday's session, and everybody I look around who was here today was here yesterday, so I don't need to go through my normal opening or explanations or anything of that nature. Also, I think we can probably forego introductions, as you all met yesterday. I don't need to go through that again. We've got a lot to get through today because obviously due to yesterday's issues, we are running a bit behind, or quite a bit behind, and we're going to try and catch up. Throughout the day, I'm going to see where we are with things. I'm hopeful we can get finished today, even if it means extending slightly beyond 5:30 with everyone's agreement, obviously. Either that or we'll have to come back Friday morning, and obviously it's on the programme. The overspill mornings are on the programme for that very potential occurrence. So, but if we can avoid it, we will. Today's agenda obviously is picking up from yesterday, which we'd got to the end of my questions 4.26, and we're going to be moving on to 4.27, which is effectively the whole part of 4.27 is going through PL11 to see whether the policy is effective. So in that regard, while we may venture now and again into matters of principle, particularly where they weren't discussed yesterday or they are particularly pertinent to the criterion, what I'm not expecting and will not allow is if we get onto a criterion, for example, about heritage, that's not an excuse or reason to then go back into all the discussions we had yesterday about heritage. This is about, are the words of the policy soundly based? And this is all without prejudice to any decision I eventually come to, but clearly if I were to conclude that the allocation is sound in principle, then the policy that backs it up needs to be effective, and so this is the opportunity to ensure, or at least discuss, whether or not those criteria would actually be effective in delivering a sustainable form of development, should it be considered sound in principle. The other thing, again, it would help me is if we do get to a criterion where there are comments about it, if you could obviously focus on what you want changing, rather than necessarily saying, well, these are all the problems with it, just we could focus on this is what we think is needed to make it sound. And then finally, the other reminders. Please try to avoid reading out statements, particularly today, as I can't see why there would need to be a statement about relatively short wording and policies. And two, you are here to obviously represent your organisation's views, not necessarily those of others. So in terms of talking about other people's representations and so on, that's not really what we're here to do. We're here to talk about what you of your organisation's representations say and what your views are. So, before we get on to the policy itself, the other thing I want to say when we go through P11, before I ask if there's any matters arising from yesterday, I'm going to take it, because obviously there's about, 17 criteria, 21 criteria. You don't want to listen to me to ask all my questions on all 21 criteria and then open it up. So what I'm going to do is take it a criterion at a time, ask my question on that criterion, get the council's view, and then open it up to any points. But I'm going to be moving quite quickly. So if, for example, I don't have a question about a criterion, I'll just say I have no questions on criterion X. Any points, if there's no boards, I'm going to move on. I'm not going to sort of wait. And hopefully I'm not going to come back, go over things and come back, if things are missed. So I'm going to move through things quite quickly, which is not a reflection on what happened, the fact behind. I'll be doing that anyway, because that's just the nature of this sort of exercise. A similar thing will apply when we come on to the allocations, but again, it's more about, hopefully we've covered most of the in-principle issues yesterday about those, and how they all tie in, so it'll be really about the wording. Is that okay? Are there any questions about that? Any points anyone wishes to raise? Does it all make sense? Happy? Good. Okay. So, Mr. Reid, there were a few, again, trying to think about expedience, getting through things. There were a few outstanding questions you said you were going to get back to me on. You may or may not have answers to some of those. Would it be sensible, I think it will, I'm suggesting it might be sensible, notwithstanding what I just said about getting into matters of principle, but if we get to a relevant criterion for some of those things, that's the appropriate time for you to say, actually, there was a point about X, we said we'd get back to you on this is an appropriate time to mention it, rather than go through them all now. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Thank you.
If there's anything, obviously, that doesn't come up as a matter of course, then at the end we can pick those up.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So yes, we will.
Okay, good. Right, so, so as I say, I'm going to go through each criterion in turn, and my questions were about, well, actually, there's a criterion about scale. So as I say, so criterion 1 sets the scene, really. It's just a scene setting tool. I don't have any comments on or questions on criterion 1. One might argue it's not absolutely necessary, but it's not really doing any harm as far as I can say. Any points on criterion 1 anyone wishes to make? This is just sort of setting out what the allocation is. Does council want to say anything about it?
No, so save that in relation to the principles set out within the MPPF, one is looking ultimately as to whether one has an effective policy in this context. And there needn't, as an overarching point, be certainty around all issues relating to infrastructure. And so one needs to look at PL11 as a framework within which the delivery ultimately will come forward through the SPD and master plan processes. And this sets that scene.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions about the SPD. So, right, I'm going to be on the criterion 2. So criterion 2 is, so we are slightly venturing into delivery on, because this is all obviously all about how, what you've just mentioned actually, the SPD and how it will be delivered. I'll ask the questions now because it might as well get it out of the way. So this is one of those areas where I probably am delving into principle a little bit, so contradicting myself, but I'm allowed. How are you going to, and it was picked up yesterday about equalisation and things of that nature, so how are you going to ensure coordinated approach? And just on this, and we'll probably come into this when we get into the relevant, the individual allocations, where you've got 6 separate allocations with their own policies and so on, and some of them have their own requirements that seem to be related to that particular plot. Where are you going to, how are you going to ensure coordination?
So I think the starting point has to be the discussions that have already been taking place as to in order to bring forward Cruise Hill. There is a stakeholder forum, as you're aware, that is being led by the council, and the council has for the last 2 years or thereabouts been involved with seeking to deliver Cruise Hill, and that means that there are relationships being built with a number of different parties. And that, as I say, sets the background for what ultimately is envisaged under the policy, which is both through the SPD and the master plan approach, with the council taking the lead. There will be an identification of the various requirements and how those are to be delivered, including, as necessary, any equalisation that needs to come forward in order to ensure that there is the fair delivery of infrastructure which is strategic in nature. Of course, that's to be distinguished from those various elements that need to be brought forward on an individual site. And those will come forward through the planning applications, but nevertheless under the overarching aegis of the SPD and the master planning. And I say the master, I've said already that there's already a discussion process in place and framework building in place, and we know that in any event because of the documentation that's within the PLA parts of the evidence base. But so the SPD is going to be central to the delivery, and it might be worthwhile if I just set out the position on the SPD, which is that, of course, it's right that the SPD can't of itself make policy, but it is capable of, once the central policy is there, of providing detail with regard to the aspects of that policy and how that policy will be delivered. And so the equalisation process is necessarily going to be, and appropriately, brought forward under the SPD. And it couldn't be otherwise at this stage, because whilst one can see the sorts of strategic infrastructure that is required, we are not yet at the stage of knowing precisely what that is, because of the further work that will come forward with an allocation of this sort of scale. And one can't expect that infrastructure is all going to be in place at this stage. It would be a clearly over-ambitious expectation for any major allocation to have to set down in stone what the various elements are and how they're to be delivered. That will come through the further work that's to be undertaken. And rightly, we say, because of the nature of the application. What is important for present purposes is to understand whether or not there's a reasonable prospect of that which is being proposed coming forward in a way that enables you to reach the conclusion that the proposals are effective. And that will require an assessment of, in principle, are those elements that are being proposed for delivery as infrastructure elements ones that are effective in principle, and then to see whether or not there is a mechanism in place to be able to deliver them, and we think there is. So that's the overarching approach that we're taking.
Okay. The taking it back, I mean, to say this is taking us into the delivery discussion, but set the context of that. What, you have a timescale for the SPD?
There isn't as yet, as I understand it, a specific timescale, but it may be that Mr. Smith can give more detail on that. Sorry, Mr. Jones. Dr. Jones is going to speak to it.
Thank you. So the SPD is underway at the moment. So we've got consultants on board that are having initial conversations with landowners and other strategic partners. So we have a date of November Cabinet for approval to consult on the SPD.
Okay, it's largely up to you, obviously it's your process, but how are you factoring this into this process, and that you don't know what the outcome of this process is going to be, and may not know by November?
Yeah,
you might I'm more interested actually, rather than necessarily a sound decision. I'm just gone.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're keeping a watching brief on how it's going. We're in regular liaison with the consultants preparing the SPD. So keeping them abreast of everything that happens during the hearing sessions, and yeah, just keeping them alive to the issues that are arising during the examination process and any potential implications.
Okay, so we'll come back onto that, I think, when we get onto delivery, because we obviously need to talk about the your trajectory and the reality of that trajectory. So we'll come back onto that. Looking back at the wording of the policy, the way I read it, it suggests that obviously development couldn't come forward until the way I've read the policy, criterion 2 is SPD is produced, presumably by the council and approved by the council, not adopted. You don't adopt SPD, and then that's in place, and then that was obviously planning applications will flow. So is that my interpretation correct? You're not expecting to grant permission for anything prior to the SPD's approval?
No, we'd like the SPD to be in place to have that framework in place to guide planning applications.
So is that, let's go, so without prejudice, let's assume the land is removed from the greenbelt, it's all in place, and you're seeking to deliver housing. Is it actually justified for the policy to seek to resist planning applications coming forward in advance of an SPD, particularly if they were to meet all of the 24 criteria and, well, the 24 criteria of this policy and the 10, 15 criteria of the individual policies, you know, of which maybe they could be condensed?
I think in order to provide that assurance that development would come forward in a comprehensive, coordinated manner, we'd like to consider planning applications in light of the full suite of guidance to be adopted as an SPD.
I think purpose of the policy in that context, sir, is to ensure that you've got enough detail within the SPD to bring forward any particular element of the allocation itself. So one can see the reason behind it as to why it should come forward in that way. And of course, it may be the case that ultimately somebody can make a justifiable case for an exception under requirement number 2, but it at least sets the starting point that somebody would have to then persuade the council out of its initial approach.
Okay, thank you. This is probably something I'll pick up in PL10, where do I do it? And again, the question might be, well, if you're looking at these things individually, it's obviously whether they're sound individually, but I'm always interested in inconsistencies between policies, because they, shine a light on any particular problems. So there's a different approach, or seems quite a very different approach, set out for the SPD and master plan in PL10, which is Chase Park. In that policy, and I'll probably ask the corollary of that when we're dealing with Chase Park. In that policy, the SPD appears to be separate to the master plan. So here it's the master plan. I think I'm right in saying it's develop a master plan, turn that into SPD, then planning applications follow. In PL10, and here the master plan needs to be approved prior to any application coming in. But in PL10, the master plan is actually forming part, it refers to could be part of an application, or the first application on the site. So I just wondered if there's any particular reason for the different approaches.
Because there's fewer landowners and kind of complexities in that respect with Chase Park, so it's felt that the preparation of a master plan would be an effective tool to guide development in the area, whereas a stronger tool, i.e. an SPD, would be more appropriate for Cruise Hill.
Thank you. Well, the important, so there is at least there's a reason for it, so it's not an oversight. So that's okay. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned this yesterday, and I think it's today as well. There's a lot of emphasis on the SPD/master plan, or which way you look at it. And I think we'll just ignore for now the fact that this SPD may no longer exist at some point in the future. We'll just put a pin in that. At the moment, they still exist. There'll be alternative mechanisms, no doubt. I suppose the question is, and I think you've alluded to this, Mr. Reid, already, about you can't possibly know everything. But what is it we don't know that the SPD is there for? As I say, you've got figurative, illustrative master plans. You've got frankly, huge amount of background evidence. You've got your placemaking strategies. You've got all the, you've got IDPs. You've got everything you could. What is it that the SPD is doing that isn't set out in the plan? And are any of those things that should be set out in the plan, as in effect, what? And I suppose if you take it to a logical conclusion. And what you're saying about reasonable certainty is that if we're deferring things to the SPD, do I have sufficient certainty that that this is a reasonable form of development could be addressed, it could be delivered?
Yes, so I'd leave this for Mr. Smith in terms of the detail of it, but as an overarching point, an obvious area that the SPD will bring forward is a greater delineation of what the development parcels will be precisely, or certainly sufficiently precisely to make a planning application in respect of them, as opposed to the illustrative framework plan, which identifies the amounts of development and where they're capable of being disposed of. And it's that sort of detail, that level of specificity that the SPD will be capable of bringing forward. And in addition, it then enables the putting together of all of those aspects that you've just referred to, including the IDP, including equalisation, which will come through the more detailed processes. And rather than those being required now as part of this plan, which, as I say, is beyond the remit of the overarching principles that are to be included within the local plan, those aspects are best put into an SPD, into a form that everybody knows that they are working towards.
Again, thinking, this is, again, slightly grey area because it flips between this and delivery, but it's, again, thinking about the policy wording. The policy doesn't, I mean, talking about equalisation, you say, first and foremost, should the policy refer to that in order for it to have teeth later on? You know, if the policy doesn't say the words, you know, equalisation, is that problematic in terms of them trying to enforce that at a later date? Question. And then secondly, what the policy doesn't talk about, as far as I'm aware, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is phasing. And whether, again, it may well be the council has no view on phasing, and it will come forward when it comes forward, or if it has got a view on phasing, this would presumably be the criterion or the part of the policy which would refer to it. So those two things aren't referred to. Do they need to be?
The phasing, again, perhaps leave to Mr. Smith if he wants to say something specifically on that. With regard to the equalisation issue, that is referred to at 3.171 within the written statement. And that's within the part that identifies what the SPD is going to contain. It just follows on from the minimum aspects of the SPD. And it could certainly make provision within the policy itself. But since it's already identified as to how the SPD is going to come forward in the written statement, and the SPD itself is referred to in PL11, it wouldn't need to specifically go in order for there to be a sound policy.
Okay. Ironically, against 3.171, my note says, should this be in policy? So
Yeah.
The point being that
I'm sorry,
perhaps,
Mr. Smith as well.
Oh, sorry.
But I didn't want to cut you off. Is there something you wanted to say?
No, as I was saying, you know, as we know, for something to have teeth,
Yes.
and we cast our minds back to January, discussions about what is and what is not in London plan policies, for example, but what was in sporting text and what carries teeth. So
Yes, fair point.
my rule of thumb is if you want it, and you want there to be absolute certainty about what you want, it should be in the policy and not left in text. So that's just, it's perhaps not, it's something, obviously that's something for me to take away and
Yes.
come to a view on. But sorry, Mr. Smith.
Yeah, just to follow on specific to that point, actually, obviously got to be slightly careful with language and semantics and the words that are used in policy than interpretation of those words. Equalisation can have a commercial tone to it, and obviously the planning system cannot force private sector partners to enter into commercial terms. A land equalisation is usually where landowners pool their land, pool costs and values and share it equitably between them, and the planning system cannot take into that sort of commercial realm. The important thing is to make sure that there's a fair and equitable approach to developer contributions and that they are sufficient to pay for the strategic infrastructure that will be required for the multiple land interests and the overall development. And it's that kind of wording and language which is in the various policies that the criteria 13 will maybe come to around that, and in the site allocations. So the use of the word equalisation is being addressed through different words that relate more to capturing fair and equitable developer contributions. That was a point on that. On the earlier point around sort of the role status and layering up of information, I think it's probably well understood in the planning process that you build the layers of detail and knowledge as you work through the process. The spatial framework, as you referenced earlier, has got a considerable amount of work related to it that's kind of evolved the core principles, the capacity of the site, the infrastructure requirements, the broad spatial approaches to green infrastructure movement and the rest. The master plan will take that to another level of detail, as Mr. Reid said, in terms of land use sort of layouts and design, and ultimately it will continue to be evolved through the preparation of planning applications. So each stage of the process kind of builds up that level of detail. I think the councils have done a considerable amount of work for this early stage, which is still sort of in advance of the sites being allocated, to prove that it's capable of delivering all the aspects that are set out in policy. It's then sort of the specific detail around how that works in practice, including the phasing, that comes at a later date. The other aspect to that is you clearly need to be reassured that there's a reasonable prospect of those requirements being deliverable within the plan period and beyond. And there's also the phasing dimension then comes into what is required in the early phases, where you require a greater degree of certainty of then coming forward, and we may come back to it when we go through the site allocations, that certain parts of the site allocations that are expected to come forward earlier have a clearer position in terms of the infrastructure requirements. As we touched on yesterday, there are other aspects like the secondary school, which won't be required until much later in the process, and there's a longer lead in time to resolve some of those matters. Being too explicit and specific on phasing on all of these matters at this stage in the process for a scheme that will take 20 to 30 years, it would not be a proportionate or an appropriate approach, where you need to retain a degree of flexibility to not only respond to details as they emerge, but broader market conditions and other factors that will inevitably influence the overall solution.
Okay. Right, okay. Is there, again, the policy can be used as a tool to ensure that things don't happen that you don't want to happen. So it may well be, for example, that there's definitely a part of the site. I mean, in some cases, for example, it may be the council position is we would expect the brownfield land to come forward first, and that would be, it doesn't necessarily tie anyone down to what parts of the brownfield land, or but you would, or we expect a disproportionate development on the brownfield land to come forward before the greenfield, or some of things like that. If that's, I'm not putting words in your mouth, I'm just saying, if that's not, the council has no view on that, then fine. What I always trying to get to the bottom of with these when we're looking at the wording is, if there's something the council expects and wants, it needs to be in the policy, otherwise you're not going to get it. So my impression is at the moment you're not in that, you're not talking about that, so fine, we'll leave it at that. Just put your point there about the word equalisation. So you telling me that paragraph 3.171 is unsound then? Because that actually refers specifically to equalisation.
It does so, but it does so in a specific way. If so, you look at the top final column on that page in 3171. It says it's essential that the contributions to shared infrastructure requirements are based on an equitable equalisation mechanism that is agreed between parties. So it's a precise identification that the equalisation relates to the infrastructure requirements rather than it being a commercial balancing of profit, which is the distinction that Mr. Smith is making. So on that basis, we think that that is correctly drafted. It's simply then a question as to whether or not it should be going into the policy itself, at least by way of a reference to the what is described there, the equitable equalisation mechanism in respect of infrastructure requirements. That's the
okay. I mean, obviously the developer interested in the room might have a different view. I think I would say that my feeling is yes, it should, because it's policy. It's your policy. It's not. Yeah.
Certainly, the intent of the council is expressed in 171. So it would be a modification that's capable of being made.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sure some of these will come back to some of these points about phasing and everything else later on if we have time. So any points on criterion 2? Mr. May?
No, thanks.
Thank you. We'll move on then to criterion 3. I have no questions about this. It's just signposts. As far as I can tell, policies, it's just a cross-reference to policies SC1 to SC9. Again, one might question whether it's necessary, but I have no particular questions about it. Any points on criterion 3? No, thank you. Criterion 4 is about employment opportunities. So development processes collectively create a mixed and inclusive community. we have a debate about what that means. Providing a diversity of employment opportunities. What are the employment opportunities described there? Because I don't see any allocation in there for, you know, E and B use. Well, you know, office or business and, you know, the what I would normally call the employment land. So what is it you're actually talking about?
Dr. Jones.
Thank you, sir. Apologies, sir. So, yeah, Cruise Hill is a residential-led placemaking project. So it does involve, in the spatial framework, refers to a local centre and 2 local parades. So that's anticipated to contain the kinds of small-scale employment and services needed for a primarily residential community. In addition, there'll also be some provision made, and this will be fleshed out in the SPD, for the retention for some existing uses, so glass houses and some of the current uses that currently characterise the area.
Okay. So they're, well, if they're retained, they're retained, but if they're not, it's more about the complementary facilities. This isn't like an additional exceptional circumstance that you're trying to, or seeking to see part of the area being delivered for office industry. It's which was my assumption. It was just the wording is it clear and unambiguous what it is you're talking about, I guess, when it just says employment opportunities. But I guess I can, yeah, it's not a massive issue.
Yeah, that's correct, sir. So we don't envisage this site accommodating strategic industry, logistics, or office needs.
Okay, I'll have a think about that. Any points on, yes. Sorry, over 50, sorry.
Thank you very much. For the over 50s and older than that, there's a huge concern for employment for young people. And we see Cruise Hill with the garden centres. It's more than garden centres now, it's animal husbandry, all sorts of things. I won't go into great detail. There's a college nearby with 3,000 students in it. And it really feels like Cruise Hill and those businesses that are already there, which amounts to far more than greenhouses, although lots of the plants that are sold are increasingly grown locally. It's employment that's not vulnerable to AI and online shopping, and therefore they're very, very sustainable jobs with career progress, because the college offers, I think, up to master's level qualifications in these areas. And it seems strange that, given the difficulties with employment locally for young people, that this is not something that's seen as an opportunity as part of that area. Thank you.
So are you suggesting the policy should be seeking greater and more emphasis on employment, or creating more employment than?
For sure, because it's a very specialist area. Visitors come from very, very many miles away, and many of the businesses there provide services across the southeast of England. So to not capitalise on that. I mean, once upon a time, Cruise Hill was a ragbag of unregulated development and sprawl, but that's no longer the case. It's thriving, it's developing, it's improving. And these are sustainable jobs. So yes, I would see that as a very significant hub, not in strategic, in the way that we normally think about it, but for horticultural, agriculture, and so on, it's a massive opportunity because it's unique.
Thank you. Thanks. Anything the council wants to say? Allied to that, I suppose, is again the. And it's not something I picked up on yesterday as a matter of principle, but it is the potential loss of the existing and thank you for, if you like, reminding me about that, the potential loss of the existing employment use, and you know, to the extent to which that is a negative, which has been taken into account in principle.
Yeah, so we may get into this in for criteria 9, which refers specifically to this point. But we, so yeah, without wanting to preempt criteria 9, so it does talk about the retention of specific existing rural uses as being important, including equestrian and some horticultural uses, which could be provided in suitable alternative locations. So this is really the role of the SPD to kind of firm up, you know, and add detail on what's meant by specific existing rural uses and suitable alternative locations. So that should be worked out in the preparation of planning guidance.
And when you've been doing your assessment of the suitability of the justification for the allocation, you know, what have you factored in terms of potential loss of employment and the loss of this, you know, potential loss of specialist hub, strategic hub of activity? Or is it, again, sorry, I'm thinking, or is it your intention through criteria 9 that will actually not, you won't be losing that, you'll be retaining that?
Yes, sir, that's the intention, retaining elements of it, but also supplementing it by the new population that's going to be in there and the services it will need will be creating additional jobs in retail and community infrastructure and the like as well.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on. Have you finished? Yeah, so thank you. Right, thank you. Then criterion 5 sets the scale. This is obviously an important one. It establishes the scale of development, deliver a total residential capacity of 5,583. I note that the council have suggested a modification that we reduce that to 5,500. I don't think 83, I'm not going to quibble too much about 83 dwellings in this scale. I don't have to worry too much about that. And note that you're still expecting to deliver 3,350 up to 2041. When we get on to delivery, we'll talk about that. And also, it may be easy to talk about those figures and the validity of those figures, I think, and that figure when we get onto the individual allocations, because it obviously be easy to drill down to, you know, what you've assumed for each of those parcels and whether or not they are sensible. And we talked even yesterday about scale when it came to matters of TfL's arguments or GLA's arguments about whether or not it's delivering a sufficient scale to deliver the infrastructure and accessibility. So we've already talked about that. So bearing in mind that we've had opportunities to talk about scale, we'll have more opportunities to talk about scale. I have no particular points on criterion 5 at the moment. Any points on that anyone wishes to raise? Good, thank you. Criterion 6 speaks to well, again, it's one of many references to things, and I think we're going to start getting into areas of duplication and repetition soon enough. But so new neighbourhoods within the CHPA, that's not defined. Sorry, it must be limited to areas with good access to public transport options. Residential densities will reflect access to public transport with higher density development in those areas with the best access to rail and bus services. We talked a lot about this yesterday, but what you've got two things in there: good access to public transport options and best. So what is it, in terms of clear and unambiguous? Is it going to be clear what that means? And does it imply that there are going to be areas that would remain without good access to public transport options? Because if I suppose I'm not saying if your point is that where you're, you know, maybe one thing follows the other. You know, the public transport will go in. That's where. I suppose what's the point of that criterion? I suppose because what's it telling us? We don't. You know.
So it's identifying a hierarchy essentially by reference to the baseline, which is that, and this is all in the context of residential, but with neighbourhoods being provided with good access, and that's the overall aim, good access to public transport, and then if it's going to be higher, it's going to be in those areas that are best suited to the delivery of those higher residential densities. So in that sense, it's recognising that it has to provide it with good access, otherwise it's got to be high. If you're going to have more people in a particular location. And then that's to be distinguished from other aspects of the identified areas within the placemaking zone, for example, the open spaces, where there'll be less requirement for it to be accessible by public transport for obvious reasons, because it's delivering actually for those at Cruise Hill itself. So I think that's the purpose behind it. I'll be told if it's otherwise.
It's a sort of seems a bit of a chicken and egg thing, because you've got your SPD will identify where the development's going to go. The development then, presumably, that would then drive your proposals for improving public transport, because you're not going to obviously improve public transport where you're not intending to deliver housing. So it just seems like almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. And then, of course, best, in a clear and unambiguous point of view. Well, best is a relative term, so you could have high-density development. If public transport access isn't particularly good, there's still going to be an area of the best, but it still might not be suitable for high-density development. So, okay, but I think this is, and there's other. I mean, I've got a note here that says, it seems to effectively duplicate criterion 15 or elements of criterion 15. So we'll come on to that. I think it's a running theme about this. But yeah, okay.
Quite so. I think the purpose of this first part of the policy is, as it says, to set out the overarching strategic requirements, which are envisaged as going, or as directing the SPD. So it provides that sort of general approach that will be sought to be delivered by that means.
Okay.
And then the detail starts to come through in the later parts of the policy.
Understood from a directing the SPD perspective. That okay, rather than a necessarily decision-making perspective.
Yes. So yes.
Okay, fine, thank you. Any points on 6? No. So 7. 7 is, I think, the majority of this policy is cross-referencing other policies, but it does emphasise the need for family homes, which we've talked about. Any further comment on that? I should also say that criterion 4, sorry, jumping back to criterion 4, also refers to housing types and tenures and environments in accordance with DMH3. So you've got criterion 7, which talks about the mix, doesn't talk about criterion H3, policy H3, but another criterion does. So, but ultimately, you're going, So it's all a bit, all over the place a bit in that respect. But
it's noted that it's noted so one could have referred to H3 as part of paragraph 7 rather than including it in paragraph 4.
The thing about providing new family housing, I mean, again, it's not a contradiction per se. I mean, you've started, obviously, there's an underlying premise that part of the Greenbelt exceptional circumstance argument is about delivering family homes. It's not just about that. It's about, obviously, there's the overall quantity of issues, affordable housing, I understand that. But if you're then again, purely from a policy point of view, if you're referring back to H3, and logically over the lifetime of the plan, what the most up-to-date information on housing type and tenure is probably going to change. It will change over time inevitably. Is saying at this stage you must deliver family housing potentially in contradiction to the H3 argument? Wouldn't it be simply enough to refer to H3? Or is it because of the particular need for family housing you've identified you're kind of going beyond H3, but then you don't need to refer to H3? If you know what I mean?
I do so. It depends on how one refers to H3 in that context. Where the first reference to H3 was in the context of mixed and inclusive communities, and so will incorporate all of those elements that are identified by reference to that, as you can see. And the particular emphasis on family housing is one that the council considered needed to be specifically emphasised in the policy in other respects, hence why it's in paragraph 7, amongst other places.
The other part, the end of that criterion, talks about the provision of gypsy and traveller pitches must be explored, subject to the policies and proposals to be set out in the Enfield Traveller Local Plan. We talked about this a little bit in stage 1, but my understanding is you're not making an exceptional circumstances case based on gypsy and traveller needs. So in that respect, is it actually appropriate to suggest that that could be part of the mix on this site if that's not part of the justification for releasing it from the greenbelt? And sorry, before you answer that, you may as well get all of my points across. You're asking people in this plan to refer to policies in a plan that isn't already adopted. So from my point of view, I don't see how I can consider that to be sound, because I would be relying, basically speculating on whatever the Traveller Local Plan says, which I can't possibly do. So I will put my cards on the table, and I don't think it's appropriate to refer to gypsy and travellers in this part of the policy, or in these policies.
So I think there are two parts to that, as an answer to that. The first point is that you're quite right that there's nothing within there's no evidence at the moment as to the way in which the Traveller Local Plan is going to be adopted and what sites are going to be identified through that process. And that's why the drafting of PL11 isn't positively stating that there'll be the delivery of the site or a site within Cruise Hill, but says rather that it needs to be explored subject to the policies, so that if there is a decision that there's no plan, site required within Cruise Hill, well then it will override anything that might be in PL11. So in that sense it works negatively, so rather than positively. It's not actually committing you as the decision maker on soundness to reach some conclusion as to the potential for the delivery of the local plan. So that's the first point. But on the other hand, the council's reached the conclusion that Cruise Hill, given the scale of the allocation, does have the potential to deliver a site as ultimately is considered appropriate, the potential to deliver a site on the allocation land. And that's why it simply makes reference to it in that sort of way. But the protection for you, and the protection in terms of any conclusion around soundness, is that it isn't positively relying upon what will come through the local plan. It says in terms that it's subject to the local plan, the Traveller Local Plan coming forward. That's the purpose of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've discussed in stage 1 the merits and appropriateness of having 2 plans, and obviously I've not concluded that thus far, and my point of view that not ideal, but we are where we are with it, and there are mechanisms in, it's not an absolute requirement. There has to be 1 plan, but it's not obviously helpful from this regard, where I'd say take what you're saying, but it does say must be explored. So it is a requirement of the policy to explore something. It leaves a decision maker in a difficult position, because it doesn't say what the outcomes expected of that exploration. In terms of, I always think about these things in terms of, well, like a tailpiece condition. It doesn't actually, so what? You can explore something to what end? So it doesn't really help in that respect. It's prejudging. I still think an element of it is prejudging what's in the Traveller Local Plan, and it's the actual responsibility of the Traveller Local Plan to deal with this issue. So it's not for me to. I don't think any indication at all that this site is being considered for gypsy and traveller needs as alongside the housing, normal, market housing, isn't appropriate for this exercise, because that's not what you're asking me to do. It's not part of the exceptional circumstances case. You've got a separate plan to deal with it. And we are not, I'm not examining this location in terms of whether it's a suitable site for gypsy and travellers, because that's not, so I think it's just not a helpful,
Yes.
it's not a helpful part of the policy, and it's just, yeah, that's my view. Yeah,
Yes, so that's understood. I've set out the purpose for it. Ostensibly, Council is of the view that that can be included within the policy structure. That said, if you reach the conclusion that it is not appropriate for it to be included as part of the policy, ultimately it will come through the local plan, the traveller local plan in any event. And a decision will then flow from what is within the traveller local plan. So its removal wouldn't affect the effectiveness or soundness of this allocation.
Okay. Thank you. Any points on, yes, 054, thank you.
Thank you very much. The London plan talks about downsizing policy H13, and it talks about 90% of new builds being accessible and adaptable, obviously looking to the long term for older people. We don't think that policy DMH5 in this criterion deals adequately with those two important points. And insofar as if this policy is about what you intend to happen, then I think we feel that that's what should be happening if older people are to be encouraged to move to some of those sites, live in some of those sites. And by emphasising family housing, it doesn't necessarily exclude, but we've had, I think, quite lengthy debates about, 1 and 2 bedroom homes and family housing and the balancing between them. And if, again, older people are to be encouraged to leave their family homes in order to be accommodated in smaller homes and release those family homes, then I think probably this needs to be more explicit.
That seems more a point about DMH5. I know obviously it's cross-reference, so it's relevant, but if this if we get onto when we get onto DMH5, sometime in the future, I'm committing to no timescale on that. Then logically, if that point can come up, then this cross-reference would still, the cross-reference itself isn't the problem. It's the DMH5 that's the problem. So I think we probably deal with that then. The point taken that.
Okay.
Because I think, the alternative would be to say something specific, to sort of, if you like, override DMH5 here and say something specific about downsizing or accessible homes or so on. But I think they've tried to shortcut that by just having a cross-reference.
Yeah, okay, I'm confident that the other policies, the smaller policies, don't have that.
Yeah, it's understood.
Thank you.
And there is obviously, I can't remember, it might be DMH5. I've got so many policies which talk about the accessible homes standards and so on. And again, we'll get to that. Thanks. But thank you. Point taken. Is there anything you want to say about that? Obviously, you've I suppose it's going to sort of try to just encompass all of that into cross-references. So if there are particular issues about those policies, again, if we get to those policies and something changes and that has a knock-on for these allocations, then I guess that would be something we'd have to come back to.
That's right. So but the overarching approach is that they should be in accordance with what are the identified needs, the delivery of specialist accommodation, including older persons housing. And DMH5 provides for that. So this is a positive policy that seeks to accommodate those sorts of needs if they exist.
Thank you. I'm going to, sorry, is that? Yeah, sorry. I'm going to move on to criterion 8. I think the only point I've got is this is about delivering a range of uses in the form of a local centre and additional local parades to optimise self-sufficiency of the settlement and meet day-to-day needs. This should include retail, community health facilities, etc., etc. My only question about this was, does it provide sufficient clarity about the scale of need? Now, I guess you could say it was meet day-to-day needs is the caveat there, isn't it? Because, you know, if it's a 100,000 square metre supermarket, well, that'd be very large. 10,000 square metre supermarket. Sorry, I'm going back to my square foot days. Would be not serving day-to-day, you know, general day-to-day needs. I imagine it's more talking about local parade, and you probably think you've got local centre, local parade. So I think I'm quite content on that. Again, it's probably one of many times local parades and centres are mentioned. Probably think about rationalisation at some point. But yes, Enfield Road Watch on criteria.
Yes, on criterion 8, we're concerned that the local centre is not going to be delivered until very late because some of the key landowners along Kettlegate Road are not inclined to sell. They have very vibrant businesses, employ lots of people, family businesses employing 3 generations of families. So I noticed it says relocation of garden centres. These are huge businesses, and I just don't see the practical way that that's going to happen. So we just have concerns that some of these things are not going to be delivered.
Okay, noted. Yeah, okay, noted. Do you want to say anything about that now, or come back to it later when we get onto delivery matters?
Perhaps in the context of delivery, I would just say now that there is always the backstop that the council has specifically stated that if it needs to undertake CPO processes to achieve the relevant uses, that's the ultimate backstop that it is identified within the policies. And this is in the context of deliverability, which is Ms. Fisk's concern. Mr. Smith.
Just one extra point worth noting. Local parades, there's obviously will be the emphasis on the central area around Kettlegate Road, but there's also local parades in SA 11.1 to serve the initial phase and in SA 11.5, I believe. So it's not just the development along Kettlegate Road, which will take longer to assemble that part of the site, but there'll be retail and other facilities provided in the other areas.
Okay. So I take it your objections not to the presence of local parades or centres or that sort of, but it's just purely, but it's a delivery issue, as I say. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. We'll move on then to criterion 9. I think I've picked up some of this already. Well, you already picked up some of this. And you talked about retaining specific existing rural uses, equestrian and some horticultural uses, which could be re-provided in suitable alternative locations if existing sites prove unsuitable for retention. And then we're back to other employment generators should be directed towards the local centre and local parades, potentially including the provision of co-working spaces. So we're moving slightly away from that earlier criterion. We're talking about new employment opportunities which weren't, they were all about local parade, working in the shops and working in the existing businesses. Now we're into co-working spaces. So how is that a different approach again?
No, I think the intention of that criterion is to support a largely residential community, and the thinking behind this raising the potential of co-working spaces is that a lot of work happens at home. Since COVID, lots of people are still working from home 2 or 3 days a week, and the idea was to make, flag the potential for co-working spaces as a kind of step up to encourage local entrepreneurship and act as a kind of complement to kind of home working and local businesses in that sense.
Okay, I take it, obviously we're still into, sometimes I feel it's a bit of a false distinction idea, well, these are the parts of the policy which are guiding SPD and these are the parts of the policy which are development management tools, because obviously they're all development management tools really, so they shouldn't be in the plan otherwise. And so that's where you, I think, end up with quite a lot of duplication, slightly different ways of saying the same thing, because of the, you know, but obviously criterion 9 from a DM perspective is quite vague, you know, lots of shoulds and coulds and maybes and things like that. But obviously from an SPD point of view, I understand you're trying to set the context for this isn't going to be completely doing away with everything that's in the area and bulldozing through it all. This is about, you know, maintaining that existing character, but with changes. So, okay, nothing else to say about that, I don't think. Although I think, you know, it is clearly something that is a little uncertain, but that's obviously something you're going to work through on the SPD. Something for me to think about the wording there. Any points on C9 that's not been raised already? Thank you. And I'll take it that, you know, even the co-working stuff is complementary to existing residential. It's not, again, not a sort of new exceptional circumstances argument.
That's correct, sir, yes.
Okay, criterion 10. This is just obviously a general nod to delivering blue and green infrastructure in accordance with the policies, so a bit of a cross-reference, without naming those policies like elsewhere, but it's just a cross-reference policy. So I don't think I've got anything to say about that, because it's not actually saying anything, really. So Enfield Society then, first one.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I think we have a concern about the way that this might be delivered, and therefore I think this policy is not worded sufficiently strongly. You mentioned that there's no actual listing of the policies in this clause, which has happened, of course, in the other ones that we've just been discussing. So I think that clause could be strengthened by making specific references. And I also think that the development must deliver multifunctional rather than will, so that we can be assured that when it goes ahead that there is due regard to the blue and green infrastructure. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just looking at criterion 17, which returns to this idea, but point taken. Yeah, point taken. We need to look at those two together to see if they do the job. Yes, please.
Yes, again, we have concerns about how this is going to be delivered. How, you know, if the landowners are giving up their land for open space, obviously it's less productive for them. This is where that equalisation comes in. Maybe Mr. Samson wants to speak to that. I believe that was in their representations. That so we just have concerns again on how this is going to be delivered. Okay.
I think I can probably take that as read now, and when we get onto the actual heading of delivery, some of these points can be picked out, because that's not really no objection to what you're saying. It's not really an objection to the wording of the. Obviously, Mr. Lex was wording. The wording isn't strong enough. Delivery issues are slightly different. So again, one gets the impression that clearly you're not opposed to a policy which requires blue and green infrastructure. It's just whether or not it's going to happen, which is a slightly different issue. But again, understood. Thank you. Yes, the council wants to come again. I think, you know, there is a. We'll come on to what criterion 17 says, but there is an internal consistency sort of approach, I guess, to cross-referencing and so on, whether or not. I suppose I'm not here to make things more effective, but I suppose whether or not that would lead to any degree of ambiguity.
Yes, we think not. It's clear that as to what it's seeking to do, and it's again in the context of the delivery of an SPD, which is why it says in accordance with in broad accordance with the concept plan, and it's important to bear in mind what that's looking at, which is figure 314. So it's identifying already the sort of areas that are going to come forward through the SPD, in accordance, as I say, with the policy of the plan. It doesn't need to do more than that.
Okay. I will give that some thought as to whether or not, as I say, you could argue this. The same could be said of the early criterion, where you've listed all of SE1 to SE9 and H3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You've listed all those. You didn't need to. I again take the point that is it necessary to make the plan sound? You may well, even if not, I might suggest that it might be an additional modification that it wouldn't hurt.
It can certainly do that. Absolutely so.
Yep.
Yes. Sorry. Just to say that there is, you'll have noticed this, but there's a reference to the concept plan there. The concept plan is referred to differently in criterion 13 because it there refers to the illustrative spatial framework. So there'll need to be some rewording to ensure that it's...
Yeah, so thank you, yes. So concept plan should be figure 3.14.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the point we talked about yesterday, and obviously something I've got to take away with, and we'll come back to on criterion 17 because it's relevant, is this issue of whether obviously it's appropriate and justified to be seeking to deliver development within areas of existing blue and green infrastructure, shall we say, and what the effect of that is. But I'll put a pin in that for now because it's being discussed. So moving on then to see, both of you? Okay.
Yeah, just picking up on that, I'm now a bit confused because Mr. Reid has referred to the concept plan, which I believe has now been identified as figure 3.14, and yet 3.14 we were told was illustrative and not policy. So I'm not sure I really understand how clause 10 can refer to the concept plan, and yet the concept plan is not policy.
That's why it's illustrative, and it's in terms stated to be such. The policy will come. I'm sorry, sir. The policy will come forward through, or rather, the specific delineation of areas will come forward through policy. This is simply indicating in an illustrative way what is proposed.
Okay, I've got the point. I can. There's a lot of issues about references to in accordance with and have regard to and so on, which is a running theme through every local plan examination. So thank you for making the point, but I will give it some additional thought and see if any changes are needed. There are other references to 3.14 and so on. So, again, as a matter of course, I'll decide, it might be determining how that should be referred to in the most appropriate way. So criterion 11 is setting out the educational requirements. So I've already asked about, so it sets out a need for must make provision for at least 2 form-entry primary schools, at least two form-entry primary schools, sufficient capacity to co-locate early years nursery, and should make provision for 1 sixth form-entry secondary school, which could be co-located with a primary school. Okay. I talked about capacity issues and everything yesterday. I'm not going to talk about that again. I note that criterion A refers to make provision for land for a 2 form-entry school, but in SA 11.1, the policy requires the provision of the land and the financing of the school, which is and I can't remember, the secondary primary school, I need to remind myself what it actually says about that. But so the PL 11 is only requiring land to be provided. The other parts of the plan are requiring the land and the school to be delivered. So what's the actual situation?
You're correct, sir. The requirement is to obviously the land for the school and developer contributions to mitigate the impact of the additional child yield from the developed. So it should be referring potentially to the 2 aspects, and the other parts of the policy do.
And also said you'll have seen this. I think this is what you were alluding to. Criterion 19, where it talks about the key infrastructure requirements, including the provision of, And there it refers to the 2 primary schools rather than just to land, but to the 2 primary schools themselves, which I think is Mr. Smith's point.
Yeah, so you've got a reference in 11 to land. You may have another reference to how it's going to be delivered in another criteria in 19. And then if you go to SA 11.1, you've got another way of dealing with it. So you've got 3 different ways of dealing with the same issue, which is, you know, we've talked about this before. Duplication repetition isn't necessarily a problem until it causes a problem. And I think if you've got 3 different ways of expressing the same requirement and it's not actually clear and they're not the same, then that potentially causes a problem. So I think it needs to be. Well, it wouldn't have been easy if you just referred to it once. That would have been ideal, and we wouldn't have these discussions. But we are where we are. You know, some of those things I would suggest need to change to be consistent.
Yes.
And I suggest at the moment that it sounds like what you're expecting is that the land is land and building. So criterion 11 is wrong.
Criterion 11, it doesn't set out the correct position, yes. Wrong.
You might want to make a note of that one, at least. I think we can be clear about that. Whether or not, obviously, the development, a content with that kind of thing, we might come on to, but it might be object. But at least, in terms of what the policy says, it's making sure it's consistent. So, fine. The other point is, I note that in terms of B, it says it's different language again. It just said it should make provision for one sixth form entry. So what does, again, there's a subtle difference in language. So what does make provision for in the context of A? Because obviously you could read that as being land. And I guess if you're looking at 19 or some of the other policies, it might be land and finance, or it might be land, or it might be, so is make provision for sufficiently clear when compared to how you've described it elsewhere?
So it could say, in terms of the specifics, it could use the words or could use the phrase must deliver as opposed to should make provision, because that's how it's contained within SA 11.5. But the meaning comes down to the same thing, we'd suggest.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, I think should make provision for might be quite clear in its own right, but when you then compare it to what you've said just above it, must make provision for land, which is very specific.
Yeah.
It leads me to the, well, is there, it's always, well, if there's a different way of expressing it, is there a reason why it's different? So is it actually asking for something different? So I think must deliver at least is pretty clear.
Yes.
Unambiguous. So.
Again, we will note that and make sure that's dealt with.
Any points on 11 for anyone? Thank you. So 11, where are we? No, 12, sorry, 1 to 12. The CHAP has been subdivided even into a number of allocated sites which collectively must come forward in a comprehensive and phased manner. So this is where you say, fair enough, you're mentioning phasing. Doesn't say what the phasing will be, but I suppose you can infer that that's identified through the SPD. Proposed site allocations will include sufficient land to enable the creation of new sustainable neighbourhood over the long term. The site allocations are identified in the policy map. Specific requirements for each site set out in the site allocation policies for each allocation. We don't really have anything to say about this because it doesn't say anything. So it's sort of, it's really a statement of the obvious and what's in the plan anyway. So the only point I would make is, I guess it's a matter of principle, I probably should have raised right at the start, is why you have this very detailed policy with all of these things set out, and then 6 very detailed policies setting many of those things out again, and whether that's necessary, that's probably just a general, effectiveness thing, and we'll probably bottom out when I'm picking out the inconsistencies. I'd be very surprised if I picked out every single one, so I will need some help in picking them out because there's a lot of criteria, but there's potentially a lot there. But it's just criterion 12 again doesn't do anything as far as I can see. But
so I think the only point to make about 12 is that it does make clear the need for not only the comprehensiveness but the phased manner in which it will come forward. And it provides, again, a framework within which one can clearly understand what the SPD is going to contain. Because if it didn't include that and the SPD started setting out phasing elements, there could be a suggestion that it shouldn't properly be taking that approach because it's not set out in the main policy.
Fair point. Yeah, that, again, I suppose my tidy mind suggests that's what Criterion 2 was for. And so, you know, the point at which this policy might get tidied up in terms of, you know, if brevity helps effectiveness, then it would be simple to add the words, you know, comprehensive and phased approach into Criterion 2.
Yes, good to that.
And then take out that unnecessary criterion, one might suggest. But
Yeah.
whether it's absolutely necessary for soundness is probably a grey area and one for me to go away and think about.
I think that might well be right. So particularly that there is, again, a specific reference, and albeit that it's in other parts of the plan, a specific reference to the site allocations being identified. They are, as I say, already identified, but it does at least tie them back into the main policy.
Yeah, I mean, actually, 12 is, apart from the phased manner, which I think is a fair point, needs to be referred to, just as my point about equalisation and the way you've described it probably needs to be referred to in policy. The rest of it is sort of supporting text, really, and it's setting context. So, because it's not driving the SPD and it's not driving decision. So, okay. Yes, please.
Just a question. So if, I'm going to mention the word delivery, but in a different context. If there is a problem with delivery, is this particular clause strong enough to stop developers coming forward? Can it actually enforce the comprehensive and phased development, or is the wording there enough to do that?
Well, it says must come forward. I think my point is it's actually already covered by other elements. So, but yeah, I mean, you know, must come forward in a comprehensive and phased manner. I suppose if an application came in that didn't do that, that's a fair point. Then it's in breach of that criterion. Then it's obviously for the council to decide whether or not it wants to allow development, which is in conflict with its policies. But that's not for me to worry about. So, no, fair point. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, it's probably another element where it's where I suppose being disregarding it too quickly. However, I do believe it could have been, you know, all subsumed within one shorter clause to make things more concise. And conciseness is only an issue where I say it becomes, you know, you can't see the wood for the trees, and everyone gets very confused about all the different criteria saying things. So, thank you for that. I think it's a very good point. So, anything to say about that?
No, save that. Again, if the phasing element was put into, the reference to phasing was put into paragraph 2, it provides another layer of protection in relation to a site coming forward that doesn't follow the phasing element.
Okay, thank you. I think obviously the actual policy, you know, what it's trying to achieve is probably right. I think it's just you know, is it all as straightforward as it might be? Okay, we'll carry on then. Criterion 13. We're now into part 2 of the policy, which I guess is now we're into the development management side of it. I guess more. So looking to see whether these criteria are effective in that respect as much as anything. But Criterion 13, again, it talks about, again, strategic and comprehensive approach, ensuring coordination of development between sites and delivery of infrastructure. Talks about an SPD is going to be developed. Again, refers to coordinated approach again, phasing again, more detailed approach to infrastructure. SPD is mentioned again. But what is this doing that's not already? Two things. What is it doing that's not already done by Criterion 2 and Criterion 12? And 2, is that a matter of soundness, other than mild pedantry?
Yes, I think I'm not going to comment on the latter observations. Not something I'm going to comment on. Not that I think that it is. It's because actually, you make the point rightly that there is repetition. The issue is whether or not that affects soundness. Is it? And it would affect soundness if there was an inconsistency between the statements in paragraph 13 and the earlier parts of the policy, and there isn't. It's consistent. So whilst it may be pejoratively called wordy, it nevertheless doesn't undermine the effectiveness of the policy. From another perspective, it does reiterate the need to follow the requirements of the SPD.
So if I may also just add to that, and notwithstanding your point around sort of wood for the trees, but as it's under the strategic design kind of section, there's a section in the middle that refers to land uses, design guidance and design code. So it's tempting to bring in those elements in terms of a strategic approach to design of the place, which is a slightly narrower point, but I understand the point. It's within the midst of repeating some of the other aspects that you've already flagged.
I think that's probably my point when it comes to effectiveness, because that point can easily be lost. I mean, it's a very long criterion, saying a lot of the same stuff that's been said before, and pulling out. And I think a lot of my points, when I come to things of repetition, when I read through the paragraph, I think, well, there is like on that one about phasing, that's mentioned there, so that's a germ of that's important, and that's not mentioned in the other criteria. So it's important, but then there's so much of the rest of the criteria which is exactly the same. You can easily lose what is actually important and just disregard it as being, well, it's just repetition. So I think that's where I'd be concerned, again, with sorry for using too many cliches, can't see the wood for the trees, throwing out the baby with the bath. You look at that and go, well, it's not saying anything. But actually, yeah, well, if you take out that little bit about design code, well, that's important. It's, the bits I've underlined, if you like, And so, yeah. It's where I think where it becomes an potential effectiveness issue, is where important things can start to become lost or underplayed. But that's yeah. So okay, I think again, these sort of things, I think for me to perhaps advise on once I've gone through it all. Again. It's not a criticism, it's just the way you council have gone about it. There's a lot of subheadings in the policies, and subheadings, so you get like a subheading on urban design and layout, and then you've got a subheading on blue and green infrastructure, and you've got subheading on something else, but actually the ideas are all very similar sometimes, and so because you obviously wanted to make sure when under design you've covered everything, and then under blue and green infrastructure you've covered everything, well, you're actually covering the same things, and it just probably adds to the length, and again, people might say, well, you don't have to, Mr. Rees, you don't have to worry about that, but I do worry about it because it's, well, I've had to sit and read it for a start, but also, I've got to think about putting myself in the shoes of people who are trying to use the document. Is it going to be an effective document if, it is unnecessarily repetitive? So, and there I am being unnecessarily repetitive, so I apologise. It's easily done, isn't it? So any points on 13?
Sorry, another question. Does an SPD go out to public consultation? Because I noticed the references a couple of places that the local community is part of the SPD process, but as far as I'm aware, the local community have not been involved yet in the SPD, which we hear is nearly complete. So does it go out to public consultation?
Not really the avenue. That's the conversation you can have with the council outside this. You don't need to have that debate here, but as you've asked, I'll ask the council to confirm.
Yes, the finalisation, as Dr. Jones said, is finalisation for the purposes of sending out for consultation, and so it will be consulted upon. And in fact, I think is included, the requirement to consult on the SPD is included as part of the statement of community involvement, so it will be consulted upon.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, that was I went off on a slight tangent there, but we'll move on to criterion 14. again, there's an element here of what purpose does this serve. It seems to basically be setting out basic planning principles, rather than perhaps being clear about development. Again, this is what I mean. You know, there's an element there about not prejudicing long-term development. That's a really important point. But it's lost within this, potentially lost within all the stuff about planning applications will be in accordance with other policy in the local plan. Well, yeah, obviously. Talk about SPD again. You know, I don't know how many times you need to mention the SPD. So that fundamental, really important point about not prejudicing development is potentially lost. Now it's there, so you know, is it a soundness issue? I just highlight it really as a point. I've spotted the most important part of the policy, which is about not prejudicing long-term development, but it doesn't really do a great deal else.
Yes, I think I'd take a point entirely in terms of the first sentence. The second part, beginning planning applications, does feed into ultimately the last part of it, the last sentence, in terms of not prejudicing the overall long-term development, because comprehensiveness is part of the process of ensuring, or is a necessary corollary to the not prejudicing the development of the whole area. So those two elements are both important, I think. So, but paragraph 14, so the first sentence, paragraph 14, I accept is something that needn't necessarily be there. Again, I won't repeat my point. So about.
Yeah, it's point taken, and I think it's just something I'm going to have to deal with, or not, if I decide it's not necessary. I think there is a suggested main modification to criterion 14, which suggests you've said should follow the guidance in the SPD. And that's obviously, again, for a bit of background, generally speaking, you can't be in accordance with SPD because it's not policy. So the way the council's dealt with is generally to say have regard to SPD or have regard to other documents. I think in this case it's slightly different potentially because you still can't say necessarily it's not policy, but obviously this is something which will have gone through a certain process, and as you said, there's certain elements of consultation and so on, so it carries a certain level of weight, which might be different to, say, for example, a document like, you know, we want to refer to some study that somebody's done. That's completely out with the process, where obviously this will be a council document, it's been through a consultation process, some form of approval process, might carry a different level of weight, but obviously it still can't carry the weight of policy. So, I mean, there's perhaps, again, something for me just to go away and cogitate on is whether should follow is anything different in accordance with in practical terms, perhaps inference.
No, but as a matter of principle, so long as the policy sets out, as I say, the framework and the essential principles that are not undermined by the SPD and are followed under the SPD's requirements, it is still appropriate for the main policy to say that the elements or the aspects of the SPD will be followed. So that's certainly capable of being properly the subject of the main policy. And whether it's followed or in accordance is then perhaps not of very much substance.
It's also slightly, again, because it'll be all connected in, one assumes, from the way that it's been described. It'll all be connected into planning permissions anyway, and you know, it's all going to be agreed beforehand by the developers and so on. So it's not quite the same as, so say, you know, it should be in accordance with Natural England's document X, which has no status whatsoever, and so on.
No, quite.
So that's something for me. There was, I've got a note here about clarity between. No, nothing there. So okay. Sorry, is that a new point? Okay, move on. We're doing quite well. I'm going to just carry on while we've got some momentum.
Yes.
A little bit to criterion 15. We'll have a break shortly. So criterion 15, we're into urban design layout. To realise the placemaking vision, development Cruise Hill should demonstrate how, not a phrase I'm particularly keen on, it will contribute to making good place in line with policy S2. So again, elements of cross-reference, and then you've got various sub-criteria, some of which are, again, quite standard. Just want to make sure we are, again, talking about getting internal consistency correct. So, you know, I think this is where it duplicates the SA policies and whether it does so without causing issue. So criterion E refers to, and it might be obviously internal densities as well. So criterion E refers to a range of densities that are appropriate to a neighbourhood, with the higher densities to the east of Cruise Hill Station, other local centres, and the areas of highest public transport accessibility. That's a very different wording to the earlier criterion we talked about, which talks about the best, you know, high densities with the best public transport accessibility. Highest, and you know, it's a slightly different phrase, but also that earlier criterion doesn't talk about necessarily local centres and parades and so on. So I think I can understand, you know, obviously the thrust is the same, but the wording is ever so slightly different. So maybe again, this is for something for me just to go away and think about and decide whether or not I find it inconsistent to the point of problematic.
Yes.
Is there any comment on that?
The point noted that the wording is different. The purpose, as you say, so is the same. It is providing more specifics, and as a matter of principle, one can see why it would be appropriate to have the higher densities within those areas that are identified in E. So the real question, I think, is for your purposes as to whether, as you say, there's an inconsistency now in the light of those two aspects. But the part 2 is descending into greater detail. So one can see if a planning application came in, one could see that a developer would be in difficulties to say that, well, as a result of what's in the broader part of the policy in part 1, you can ignore what's in part E. So it's, because it's gone into greater detail, it will now be the central point of focus for any planning application. So I don't think, on that basis, it wouldn't be inconsistent. If it was inconsistent, it's better that it's more specific under E than less specific.
Agreed. Yeah, I think yeah, agreed. There's other examples. G refers to the range of uses. Again, you know, obviously there's already lots of talk about the range of uses, not necessarily saying anything different, just saying it differently. Saying it differently as in the words, probably trying to get to the same outcome or very similar. K repeats other policies related to energy efficiency. I think you've made your point about soundness. I will keep raising these things because it's something you need to perhaps think about. Yes. And you may wish to, at some point in your deliberate, you know, as well as me suggesting main modifications in the fullness of time, you may wish to put some to me if you feel that you've identified any particular problems. So that's the duplication issue. Then there are some issues of whether the criteria are sufficiently clear and unambiguous. That's my favourite phrase of the framework, actually, clear and unambiguous. So, for example, H, use the context of varied and utilitarian glasshouse building form and horticultural land use, etc., creating a unique lifestyle related to the identity of place. I don't know what that means, and I've been a planner nearly 30 years. So, perhaps, is that clear and unambiguous?
I think the first part of that sentence is the clearer one, and your point is noted on the creating a unique lifestyle related to the identity of the place. Point noted on that. But one can see the aim, and the aim is actually brought forward through the first part of that policy. I don't know whether Dr. Jones either wants to take responsibility for that wording or he wants to explain.
I'm afraid I'm not responsible for that specific wording, but I understand my colleagues who did prepare that intended to put together a kind of, I guess it's a high-level design principle intending to draw on the best and the most distinctive character of the existing area in future development. I think that's what lies behind that.
There you go. That's the wording, isn't it? Keep it simple. You know, what is it you want to achieve? Write that, not things which I imagine nobody would be able to know what that means. Maybe I'm being ignorant, I don't know, but it's just I find that very difficult. Just the other point on again, a little less. Again, it's probably about ensure development is flexible to accommodate the likely changes over a 20-year period, longer build-out period. Again, from a reasonableness perspective, and you're talking to a developer, say, right, this is a requirement of the policy. You've got to predict what's going to happen over the next 20 years. Is that justified in the first place? And B, is it actually is it realistic for anyone to? Again, how could you say, well, that's not met criterion I, or that has met criterion I? What is it anyone's supposed to do? I don't know.
The timescale is something I think that Dr. Jones may be able to comment on as to why it's appropriate to have that longer timescale. But in order to ensure that there is future-proofing of a development, given the scale, given the timescale one's looking at with regard to it, that future-proofing aim is a sound one, we'd say. But as to the 20 years, I don't know whether Dr. Jones has something to say about that.
So I think the intention of that is to ensure that the kind of built forms and typologies and spatial configurations are flexible and can kind of accommodate kind of changes to, I guess, kind of forms of housing delivery and economic practices over a long period, the period that it's intended the placemaking area will be built out over.
So could you give me an example of how the phrase design choices should be robust, resilient and adaptable? Okay. It's okay, I understand that. But what would that look like? I mean, what's the outcome of that? What does that mean in terms of an output?
So I think a potential example of that would be designing commercial premises so they can accommodate a wide range of different types of commercial uses, so they could serve as maybe a shop or an office or a nursery. So they wouldn't necessarily need to be demolished, and kind of there's a kind of embodied carbon implications to designing buildings for a very single narrow use that then need to come forward for redevelopment when that use is no longer required. So I think that's the intention behind the policy, is that it's future-proofed in that sense, so it can accommodate changes of use and different activities over a longer period.
That's fair enough. I think that's obviously perfectly reasonable. Probably described in a different way would be clearer. So I think in the way you've described it, in fact. So okay, and then finally, I think just an example, criterion J, demonstrate how proposals have considered the relationship between both existing and future anticipated adjacent uses. Okay. It's a similar sort of thing, isn't it? The proposal will need to demonstrate how, as uses and the built form changes over time, the impact on the amenity of existing and future residents, in particular the nature of Cattle Road, has been considered and any negative impact minimised and mitigated. So I think that's basically, don't have an unacceptable impact on the living conditions of existing residents.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell, so yeah, that's correct.
Okay, right, okay. Yeah, okay. So I think, simplification and potentially some simplification there.
Just one point on that. I think that this is also trying to capture the future as well, because as development comes online, it may mean that, for example, the orientation of houses didn't properly take into account that there would be something happening next door or in the neighbouring vicinity. So it's that sort of, again, a future-proofing exercise.
It's also, again, goes to the prejudicing, presumably as well, speaks to prejudicing future, by not doing something which would prejudice. And remind me the phrase about I forgot, it's gone out of my head, not introducing a use which would then impede the existing uses of, so if you want to put housing next to the existing business, it would impede those, and the phrase in the frameworks escaped me for the moment. Yeah. Yeah, but I know what I mean. Yeah. Sorry, and just on K, while we're actually talking about K, because it's just reminded me, I touched on this yesterday, and it's in the IDP about the heat networks, and we talked about heat networks. And this obviously does say, and I think we'll come back to this when we get delivered. I just want to again foreshadow what we're going to talk about there, where it says that, facilitate a shift towards net zero carbon future through new energy efficient homes. It's probably a cross-reference there to the other policies probably, and facilities which should connect into local heat networks. So there's an expectation. I mean, there's always a debate about should versus must, but there's an expectation there about joining into heat networks, which might not necessarily reflect what I've seen in the IDP and the costs, but you'll be able to explain that to me either now or later.
We can address that to some degree now, if you like. Yes, so in the IDP, the heat network infrastructure is down as a desirable, which reflects the should rather than the must language here. It's a policy ambition of the council, and there is the local heat network company that's established and is there available to be used. So it's an ambition, which is why it's should and why it's desirable in the IDP.
Okay, I'm going to, obviously, that in those in criteria, those are examples. I'll probably come back with any views I've got on others. I don't think we necessarily need to discuss them ad nauseum. Comments on, where were we? 15, sorry, such a lot. It goes over so many pages. Sorry, yeah, criterion 15, thank you. I hope 50 is for me.
Thank you. Very briefly on H, please. It seems to me that maybe undermines any intentions about retaining the economic value of the existing garden centres, which, just as an aside, gardening is a really important fitness activity for older people, and the garden centres are very significant in minimising isolation and loneliness in older people, which is a major concern for relevant authorities. But the local heat networks, we find, and forgive me, I'm talking about NCAF now, but the over 50s feels the same. The phrase local heat networks is open to an enormously wide interpretation. Forgive me if everybody already knows that. And there are many solutions which are economically and environmentally more satisfactory than connecting to the energetic heat network, which gets its heat source from burning waste. Things like ground source heat pumps, and there are now water-cooled air source heat pump. There's all sorts of things, and it just worries me and it worries us that even should, as an ambition to connect to a heat source which is, I don't know how many kilometres away in Edmonton, with underground pipes the length and breadth of Enfield, can hardly be described as a clean, green or sustainable solution when there are other alternatives. Forgive me if that should come up elsewhere, but I think it's important to say.
Okay,
now.
I'm not going to go back to your reps to see whether over 54 made those comments at Regulation 19 or not, but obviously a reminder that comments made today should only be based on what you said at Regulation 19 and not, and I say not representing the views of others who have taken the decision not to attend. But point's been made. We will be coming on to local heat networks under whichever policies they are. I can't remember the numbers. And again, as I've said, when we get onto the specific policies, if they then have knock-ons to the allocation policies, then clearly that would have to be taken into account. But you may wish to want to say something about that. I mean, there is the alternative, of course, is whether this is just really a cross-reference. In effect, it's a cross-reference to those policies rather than something specific about this area. My guess is, and my assumption is that really it's really seeking to be a cross-reference rather than saying this area is any different to any other area.
Yes, that's correct.
So I think the suitability of local heat networks as a solution is something we'll pick up under those policies specifically and deal with it then, because it's a wider issue than just this allocation. It's not just about, if it was just there is no heat network anywhere in Enfield and it's just going to be this site, then it's clearly very much this site. I think this is just reflecting other policies in the plan, and like sometimes they've used the cross-reference and sometimes they haven't, which yeah. So again, the point is made and taken. Is there anything you want to say about H? Okay. Right, we've got to the end of, we're doing quite well, but I've, as usual, gone on. So we've got to the end of 15. We'll take a 15-minute break now, come back at 11:30, and we'll crack on and get the rest of the policy dealt with. So thank you, everyone, for helping us get through that quite quickly. Thank you. 11:30. We'll resume. Got on to criterion 16. This is about the North London waste, the existing waste site. Can you just tell me a bit more about this? I mean, I don't think it's come up before. And would the relocation that's referred to be within the allocation area or elsewhere? And have you identified a suitable relocation site? And is that deliverable? And is the relocation of the waste site sort of critical to delivery of PL11 or not? So three broad topics.
Yes, thank you. So I anticipate it's going to be Mr. Smith who will deal with this, but perhaps Dr. Jones, but otherwise.
So the intention of that requirement is just to flag the existence of the North London Waste Plan and the specific considerations that would need to be borne in mind if the site came forward for redevelopment.
So there's no expectation of that. That's not part of the proposal. This is, if you like, a pure development management policy or criteria that if something were to happen, this is what we'd have to do, rather than we intend to or we expect the relocation. I mean, is that waste? I mean, again, you have to forgive me. I've visited the area. I'm not going to be as knowledgeable about the area as you in terms of whether the waste. It talks about the existing waste site. So is that operational and running? And I did see perhaps the use what you're talking about.
Yeah, I believe the site is in operation currently. Yes, that's correct, sir.
So just going to my point about the relocation isn't a requirement of any comprehensive development. Is that the case?
It's been accommodated within the spatial framework in its allocation, its current form.
Right, so it's not intended to move?
No.
Sorry, if I can hear you, it's too loud. Then, so obviously the logical extension of that is that its continuing operation does not affect or prejudice the delivery of the vision as a whole.
That's correct, and it's associated with green infrastructure and buffers as part of the spatial frameworks, various aspects to it.
But it's right to note, I think, that the PLA 3, I can just give you the reference to help. Page 98 identifies that retention and buffering under the framework, but the relocation of the waste site in line with the requirements and hierarchy of the North London Waste Plan would be strongly encouraged. So there's that twofold aspect to it, and that actually carries through into the illustrative plan at figure 314.
So on 314, it says existing location of safeguarded waste site dash it's the relocation strongly encouraged. So the maroon blob is where it is now, but there's no current plan or site or scheme to relocate it. And as I say, and if it isn't relocated, it doesn't actually affect anything. Is that the point? So aspiration, but not expectation.
That's correct, sir.
And if it were to be relocated, what would the expectation be for the alternative? Because is there some... I mean, again, obviously, at this stage you might not, it's not in the SPD or anything, but is it something, is it going to be, would it be housing, green infrastructure, unknown? I only ask because when you look at, again, in what we were talking about yesterday in terms of greenbelt boundaries and so on, if I was to use 3.14 as a guide, the waste site rather, is sort of on the cusp of some open spaces and stuff toward the periphery of the site. So, you know, what is the reason for removing that area from the greenbelt? One might argue if it's not part of the placemaking vision, assuming it's in the greenbelt, but it is in the greenbelt.
Well, I think it's still part of the vision for the area, because it's a matter of relocation rather than removal. So something, if it is going to take its place, will take its place in a format that, again, is consistent with the overall aim of the allocation.
And the policy makes no pronouncement on where that relocation should be, so it's not a case of necessarily relocating within the area. It's just something else. Sorry. Okay.
It's true. So
I've understood. Thank you. Any comments on C16? Sorry, criterion 16. I should say. Thank you. Criterion 17. We've got 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Several subclauses. My first question, yet again, is, to what extent is this...
Hasn't at least gone to double A.
Quite, yeah. Running out of letters. Is the extent to which this is repeating other elements. I think, just in general, I suspect, unless there's something that jumps out through discussions, I'm content, or people want to raise particular issues about this, I'm content. If you're content, if I feel it is something that is necessary to change purely because of a repetition issue or a duplication issue, then I'll probably just advise on that as a matter of course. But obviously, I'll try and highlight where I've identified potential problems, because you may want, obviously that might be soundness issues that you want to talk about, if that's okay. But I suppose my question was, does criterion 17 serve a purpose? I suppose it must do to a extent, because there's so many subclauses in there that if you were to go through each one and pick out elements, they are all, there's probably bits of quite a few of them which are quite pertinent and so on. So I don't want to necessarily go through all of them in turn. But I've got a few points I just want to pick out. So criterion, the third bullet of 17B. So So 17B is about, and we've talked about this, but talks about seeking to protect and enhance sinks within the placemaking area. Ensure there are no long-term adverse impacts on the sink's function as wildlife corridors and protected sites. That's fairly clear. I'm just going to come back onto that. But my first point on B, is the fourth bullet of that list, which is just really reflecting policy on mitigation, is where development of the sink is unavoidable, an appropriate mitigation and compensation strategy should be prepared by suitably qualified ecologists. That to me is just process, not policy, and the actual policy is set out already, which is follow the mitigation hierarchy during the design process. So it's basically saying the same thing, but I have a thing about saying what studies should be provided. That's validation requirements and process. So I suggest that bullet is not necessary and is unsound.
I accept that that's a matter of process rather than saying what, as a matter of policy, should happen.
In terms of more general points, picking up on what we talked about yesterday, is whether or not this criterion and any others within this section fully reflect what actually is intended. And by that, I mean, obviously, there's some talk about development being in the... If development is to be allowed within parts of sinks, first thing is, does that need to be sort of clearer in a way? Because obviously, in terms of seeking to protect and enhance sinks, does not sit comfortably with developing in them. That's the first thing. So is the policy actually reflecting what is expected? And then in terms of how the council's gone about identifying where it's comfortable with development in sinks, to what extent, is that slightly different to what you've set out as being like the standard mitigation hierarchy? So what you're talking, if you're starting from the premise that development is going to happen, or potentially going to happen, you need to be setting out the limits to that, because we talked about it yesterday. Where are the limits to that, and how are you going to decide where it is acceptable, where it's not acceptable? Where do you draw the line? Where is the bar? Whereas that is just setting out standard national policy. Well, it might be that would stop and it might be when the assessments are done, you might not allow any development in the sink. That might demonstrate that, but. Perhaps it's a long-winded way of trying to understand is whether this actually reflects what it is you're actually seeking to do.
Yes, thank you, sir. The approach that's adopted within this part of the policy is to seek to ensure that there is protection and enhancement of the sinks as a matter of principle. And as I said yesterday, it's only in circumstances where it's necessary in order to deliver the parcel, the development within the various parcels, that there would then be consideration of development on the sinks. So the approach that's adopted within national policy, which seeks to, as a matter of principle, protect sinks from development, but then subject to a hierarchy, is principally reflected in paragraph 7 or criterion 17 and following. There's more detail, of course, around criterion 17, and it seeks to make some rather specific protective elements in relation to certain sink allocations. See, for example, criterion 17D. But what it isn't doing is saying, as a matter of principle, there will be development in the sinks to this degree. And the reason it doesn't do that is because it's clearly, from the council's perspective, much more important that there is, as a starting point, overall protection. Now, as I said yesterday, at the same time, the various allocations, SA11 allocations, will make provision for housing to a certain level. And that's derived in part from consideration of whether or not the sinks will be harmed if development is brought forward. And it's been shown that that can happen without it having a significant effect on those sinks. But that needs to be the subject of further detailed consideration through the development management processes and through the SPD processes. So that as a result of that, it wouldn't be right at this stage to set in stone what the levels of development will be or their location. Hence why there's only an illustrative indication of the development parcels. So in simple terms, criterion 17 does the job of protecting and specifically protecting the particular sinks that have the potential to be affected, and then provides further levels of specificity to ensure that protection.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Smith, I think my one.
Okay, sorry, go on.
So if it's helpful, yeah, I think one of the key elements of criteria 17 on A is where it refers to protect and enhance ecologically sensitive habitats. And it's the ecologically sensitive habitats being the key element, and whether that's I understand from the points you were raising yesterday was that as a sink there's ecological value across for the whole designation for a reason, but as we went through the evidence-based document, it did reveal that there are certain areas within the sinks that have no or negligible ecological value, and that's where the development is being proposed. So there may be something in that in terms of giving greater specificity to what are the areas of ecological value that are being protected through here that you may require a strengthening. I think that's your point here, and whether that extra wording to refer to as identified through ecological survey or whatever it may be to strengthen the kind of the reference to what sensitive habitats actually entail and their status. I think we also heard yesterday that there are differences of opinion sometimes in terms of studies that are done on which areas have those kind of values. So it does become quite difficult to have a binary kind of check as to what that limit is, but there may be some improved strengthening that you feel is necessary to focus this.
Yeah, thank you. I think my thinking is, yes, you're right. I think it's fair to say, I understand, yes, that the extent to which, well, there's a general principle, the extent to which should be developing the sink. That's something for me to think about, whether it's been justified or not in principle. And you've obviously said to me that, well, the extent of, we believe that development is unavoidable. We do believe that there are areas with lower ecological value which could accommodate development and could be done, but we can't draw a line around it necessarily. I suppose one concern I've got, particularly if the greenbelt boundaries were to remain as they are in the plan, as set out in the submitted plan, is that the policy doesn't necessarily. It might say if you read between, you can take. There are no long-term adverse impacts on the sink's function, so you can. That's a test. So if you were to expand, if you like, somebody was to start nibbling at the edges of where that bar is, well, you could probably rely on that. And as you said, you could say protect and enhance ecologically sensitive habitats. So you could probably say, well, actually, no, you're going beyond what we anticipated. It may well have been in the supporting text, but somewhere which actually sets out what you told me yesterday, which is our intention is not, what the boundaries are. We're not countenancing development in areas of higher. We want to limit it to lower ecological value. Yes, that might be something that has to be determined at the time an application comes in to be specific and more detailed information. It might change over time. Who knows what might happen. But at least in terms of the principle, obviously, if a developer wants to come forward and wants to extend that, then you've got your tests and you've got Section 38.6 and you've got everything else. But I think it's establishing what the council's bar is for even, if you like, contemplating it. not least as you are, sort of driving this delivery. So it's the council's driving the SPD, it's driving what it wants to see, it's driving the vision. I think I wonder if, yes, it should be more clear about what it's not expecting in order to give more comfort about what might happen, particularly with the boundaries as they are, because you could say, well, actually, no matter what 3.14 says, it's illustrative master plan, it could creep all the way down the golf course. It could creep all the way, into the areas of the other sinks. It could creep into the wildlife corridor that goes down the middle. All of those sort of things, because the door has been opened to potential development in sink by, what you're seeking to do. So so the alternative is if the council said, right, yes, there are some sinks in the placemaking area, but we're not going to touch. It's absolutely not touching those. That'd be a different issue. But because you've kind of said, well, there might be some potential there. Do you need to limit that potential in a way to make sure that it doesn't unintended consequences that you suddenly start getting development where you don't want it? And I'd say some of that wording might be strong enough, but it's not unequivocal.
I think the one aspect that it doesn't include, sir, that might be helpfully included is a reference to delivery in the areas of the sink with lowest ecological value, which is the principle that's driven the identification of the development areas. I was just also wondering whether it should make reference to the report that's identified those lowest areas, but that would, I think, be too specific at this stage, and better that it's setting out a general principle that's, as I say, driven the development areas.
And I think the other thing would be, taking your point that you've just said as well earlier about, there is no absolute expectation at the moment that development will occur in the sinks. You've identified some, again, for me, I guess, to go away and consider whether I consider that to be sound or not, but you've identified, if we work on that basis, you've identified the potential, but it's not an absolute, and I think that ought to be reflected somewhere, whether it's in the policy or in the supporting text, to make it absolute. It might well be, I need to there's 700 pages, I've not got a eidetic memory for every single word, but to make it absolutely clear that this is something that isn't an absolute given, so that and if you tie that into the areas of low ecological value, I think probably I wouldn't even necessarily say lowest ecological value, because that's a relative term, and something relative in the scheme as a whole, low ecological value might actually still be quite high ecological value. So I'd put low ecological value, negligible, or some words, which actually then gives an indication. But if further survey work was done and actually demonstrated it was all high, that might mean changing your proposals and reflecting that. I don't know, but that's something to think about. I think for me to think about, I'm sort of thinking out loud a little bit, but that's where my mind's going.
Quite so. And when we come on to the specific development parcels, there's more indication as to where any development should go within any of the sinks. So, yes.
Okay, maybe one for you just to note though about that. It's a potential mod to think about. For those who weren't here for the Hadley Wood, again, if I sometimes ask for a modification, it's also to help me understand. It's not necessarily that will happen. It's to help me understand that how it could work. So every modification I might ask for isn't necessarily going to see the light of day, because it'll just be, well, yes, that's a good idea, or, well, actually, no, it doesn't work, I'm not going to need it. So some of this is just to help me with my deliberations. And in this case, that might be one of those where I say, well, how would this work? And to make things clearer. Just going through criterion C, responds to the surrounding landscape, including the Theobald's Estate South area of special character, and Whitewebs and 40 Hall area of special character to the east, Clay Hill area of special character to the southwest, and Turkey Brook ASC to the west. I think this is the point Mr. Lack was raising yesterday about showing the ASCs on the policies map and whether or not, but again, that's a point that I've just to make it clear, I've noted that, but I'll go away and again, I think that's whether it's necessary or not. The question there for me, again, actually in some respects is, what's this doing in the accessibility and variety of open space part when it actually seems to be more of a design and layout criterion, which again probably doesn't really matter, but it's whether whether the point's really picked up elsewhere anyway. But I'll put a pin in that. Criterion D talks about a 50-metre buffer around ancient woodland. Any particular reason why the 50 metres, does that come out of a particular bit of evidence?
So I think it would, I no doubt have it confirmed by Dr. Jones, but I expect that this is a natural England requirement because of it being ancient woodland. There's a standing direction that they shouldn't be development within 50 metres of ancient woodland.
Yes, so we believe that's the case.
Might I suggest it would be provide at least 50 metres, because there might be some occasions where 50 metres isn't enough, depending on the nature of the ancient woodland and the
Yes, it certainly works. It works. The standing direction works in reverse, in so far as if that there should be a direction of refusal unless the development is 50 metres from the site. So you're quite right, so it may well be appropriate in certain circumstances for it to be bigger. So at least it's right.
Thank you. 17. I've not got questions on it, but I'm not stopping anyone raising anything about some of the others. But on I, 17I, this is mainly about drainage. So it is cross-referencing to SE9. So sort of not saying anything particularly new or specific. This site. The only thing it does say. Somewhere. Oh yeah, here it says, proposals will also need to contribute to the delivery of strategic flood mitigation. Well, I was sort of told yesterday that flooding wasn't a major issue across the site. So does strategic flood mitigation, if it's not being, if you're not delivering within flood zones and so on and so forth, is this seeking to deal with existing issues rather than mitigating harm? Is that justified?
If there's not a need for strategic levels of flood mitigation, then it wouldn't be a necessary requirement because it would be controlled anyway under SE9. Is the obvious response to that. So, but it may be that
Sort of prejudging SE9, isn't it? In some
yes,
respects.
quite.
Yeah. So it's the need bit. So.
I don't know whether Mr. Smith has anything further to add to that, but it's certainly in the light of the SFRA work, there wouldn't, on the face of it, seem to be a need for anything specific to be included, such as is in I.
No, nothing to add.
So that could probably come out then, and just rely on SE9. And similarly, where it talks about new development should be designed to have the capacity and means of retaining storm runoff, which would otherwise be dealt with, turning the page, on site locations downstream and other more constrained urban infill locations. Is that purely repeating SE9? Is that? Yeah. I mean, again, does it matter? But it's this very specific requirement, which may be perhaps dependent on the nature of the development rather than an absolute requirement in all cases.
Yes, I think you're correct, sir.
So perhaps a cross-reference SE9 alone is enough there. And under, oh God, where are we? K. Well, J talks about, again, avoid inappropriate use in functional floodplains. That's fine. That's a clear, that's, I think, a clear, you know, steer of avoiding areas of flood zone 2 and 3. That's very clear on number, so I've got no problems about that or questions about that. K, deliver a minimum of 20% biodiversity net gain in alignment with the desired biodiversity net gain strategy. Just, and for everyone's there, obviously, whether or not 20% is appropriate or not is something I'll be coming on to when I get on to the relevant BNG policy, because obviously national policy and statutory requirements are 10%, so I need to investigate whether 20% is justified or not. But again, rather than get into that here, because I'm assuming this is just, again, reflecting the rest of the policy. Not 20% is specific to this location, or is it 20% is specific to this? I know your policy is 20%, but would it be irrespective of that? We think 20% is justified here, or is this again effectively a cross-reference to other policies?
I think the biodiversity net gain is one of the factors to take into account when considering the quality of the development and indeed its justification for allocation ultimately. I'll need to check back as to the relevant BNG policies, but certainly the aim is to ensure that there is 20% in this case. So
if I must admit, I think the BNG policy is 20%, which is obviously a question. Although I might think, again, it's always a question whether I'm thinking about a different plan.
It's BG4.
Sorry?
It's BG4.
Which is page
158.
Thank you. Yeah. So your standard policy is 20. Obviously, at the moment, it 17K chimes with that. So it could be there's a crossroads. I suppose the question would be, again, if when we consider BG4, anything were to change because of national policy on that, then the question would be, is there a specific justification for 20% here because of the delivery of a particular vision? And would you be arguing that 20% would still be justified here? Or is this, as I say, the question would be, or is this a mere reflection of your other policies? And so if the other policies would change, like I suggest it might do if we were talking about policy for older people, whether it would flow through to this, would it flow through to this or not? You may not have an answer to that now. Maybe it's something we can pick up when we get to BG4.
Yes, we'll note that, and specifically to deal with Cruise Hill again when we come to BG4.
But obviously, without wanting to get, because if it is a sort of another way of cross-referencing, clearly national policy is 10% and the statutory requirements are 10%. So rather than get into a big debate about that, because I imagine it'll be the same for Chase Park.
That might come to force, but thank you for trying to add strength and belt can become grey belt, so can sinks be degraded to be of low ecological value when that becomes useful. So it would be nice to see something in there that protects them from that happening, since they're not going to be protected per se. And then going to E, it's interesting wording, and perhaps it needs to be reworded, but when I read create new open spaces, blah, 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 to reinforce new defensible boundaries, it implies to me that the boundaries as they stand at the moment are not defensible, in which case, as you were discussing yesterday, they could probably be moved in to keep that area in the greenbelt and create new defensible boundaries closer into the development, keeping Kings Oak Plain and Cruise Hill in the greenbelt and adding those protections to them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just bear with me a second while I make a note of that.
If you need the reference for the Kings Oak Plain, it's under Enfield Road Watch 7320. You can see the Knight Frank representation there.
Thank you. Anything the council want to come back on that?
Well, so we've already made our point about boundary, if that's what you consider appropriate. There to be development on any part of the sites that have been allocated for development, and that would be
.14 is illustrative. There would be nothing technically stopping development coming forward on that. But in terms of the plan should be setting out what the council is actually playing and has no intention. Being clear about the expectation in the policy would actually be justified.
yes. Certainly to be clear that there isn't any intention to develop on Kings Oak Plain, if that is something that's of concern, it would certainly be appropriately put into the policy. There is one other aspect about Kings Oak Plain, and I said it right at the start, actually, yesterday, which is that as part of the overarching allocation, there will be steps taken to ensure that open spaces are going to benefit from the either ecological or accessibility improvements that the whole site will deliver. And with Kings Oak Plain being part of the allocation, there's the potential for that to happen, in short. So there are benefits associated with including it within the allocation. But again, and going back to something yesterday, it can still remain part of the greenbelt, but part of the allocation. So it achieves both the protection and the benefit of delivering any improvements.
And then just the point, a useful point made on criterion E about creating open spaces along the brooks to reinforce the new defensible. So that is about reinforce new defensible boundaries to the greenbelt. It's not quite saying where there are no boundaries, create them.
No.
But what I touched on yesterday was the if you like the hierarchy, if they, you know, right, what national policy says, but in the hierarchy of, shall we say, you know, suitability, just, you know, thinking about the overall picture, that if one of your arguments for taking the greenbelt boundary and you know, separating it out from the placemaking boundary, the greenbelt boundary is to what you consider to be the next defensible boundary, but an area you're not going to develop is actually preferable to create, you know, if possible, create a new boundary somewhere by some kind of physical feature, than take the step to extend it, even though it might be slightly contrary, you know, the removal of greenbelt unnecessarily. Country